Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Stories for My Lights YouTube channel. We are coming back with part 8 of the Craig and the Magic Deck saga. Now, if you recall, in the last episode, Craig found a strange dome, and inside that dome were 4 chairs. And those 4 chairs were occupied by Carlos and Mary and some of the other pilots of the ship of Earth. He learned many things while he was there. He learned the lizard creatures were a strange species called the Cranthians who had been chasing down and trying to exterminate humanity for a long time. He learned that the Earth was powered by a giant artificial intelligence that not only did the calculations to travel them through hyperspace, but also acted as a repository of their knowledge and society. And he also learned that this AI, for some reason, which he could not understand or explain, had chosen him to be the hero of their story. And as he had learned all this, the creatures had once more started barging in, trying to get into the control room, whatever you want to call it, and presumably take control of the spaceship Earth. Carlos and Mary closed their eyes. "We must get back to our work." The other pilots closed their eyes. "You must protect us at all costs," they said, before sinking back into whatever place their mind went when they were hooked into these chairs. Carlos looked around. His knight stood by, one arm banged, beaten, and bruised. He heard banging on the iris of the door. It sounded as if the Cranthians were smashing upon it with some sort of steel hammer, perhaps a steel battering ram. He didn't know, but he was surprised to see that it was holding. It wasn't even denting yet. He heard banging on other parts of the giant dome. First the left side, then the right side, then behind him. These bangs sounded haphazard and not full of power and energy. And after a while, the banging ceased. Craig paced around, looking at the holographic projection of the globe, looking at these pilots, how still and calm they seemed when they were immersed in whatever work they were. He walked around the inside of the dome, however giant it was, but there wasn't much else there. Finally, after the banging had stopped, he sat and he slept. Well, he didn't know if it had been 5 minutes or 5 hours, but the banging started again. This time it sounded as if they were using a heavier hammer, a bigger battering ram, or perhaps even driving some sort of machine into that steel iris that protected the room. Once more, he walked over to it and looked at it. The bangs intensified in severity and power, but he saw no dents appear, and so he felt somewhat safer. Then, as before, the bangs started on different spots of the steel dome. And then, just as before, the sound stopped. It stayed stopped for quite some time, so Craig tried to go back to sleep, but he found it had been too weird and he wasn't tired enough and he couldn't fall asleep because his mind was racing. So once again, he got out his sword and he felt the memories within it guide him through some sort of sword training. He spun the sword around, he swung, he ducked, he somersaulted, he rolled, he jabbed, he fake parried, he pretended to riposte, basically every move that he could imagine. When he was done, he was covered in sweat, but he felt like some of the skill had just seeped into his bones. And finally, after that, he was able to sleep. But he knew he hadn't been asleep long this time when there came the loudest bang of all. But this time, it did not sound as if someone was hitting the dome with a hammer. It didn't sound as if someone was ramming a battering ram into that iris. It was the low, deep, raspy rumble of metal grinding against metal. At first, it was only somewhat loud, but then the noise began to get so loud he had to plug his ears. Dust and shavings started falling off of the metal roof. He could feel the air itself vibrating around him. And that's when he knew. This wasn't a Cranthian or a group of Cranthians. This was one of the giant drilling machines. And in his heart of hearts, he knew that soon it would get through. "Knight, follow me!" The knight shambled over to him, and they walked to where the noise was strongest. Craig plugged his ears, but the knight, of course being a magical creature, did not seem to mind the sound. He waited, and he waited, and he waited. And finally, after some time, he saw a metal tip protrude through the steel wall. He could hear the grinding get louder, and the tip kept coming through. He tried to hit it with his sword, but it had no effect. A mere sword couldn't chop through a drill blade the size of this. Before long, the entire drill was through, and then it started backing out. Craig was extremely afraid. He knew a moment of reduced fear as the drill seemed to get stuck as its direction reversed and it tried to pull the drill out. But after a few loud whirs, the blade came loose, the drill backed out, and there was a hole open. The Cranthians did not expect Craig and his knight to be there waiting. Two jumped through, looking around, and before they knew what hit them, Craig and the knight had chopped them down. Three more jumped through. Craig and the knight actually made fairly short work of these two. Craig could feel that somehow the spirit or the information from the sword was getting into his bones. He was reacting faster. He was relying less on the sword and more on himself, or rather, the both of them working together. They fought. Craig soon lost track of how many of the creatures had come through. They started coming through in larger groups. Craig was engaged in battle with three of the Cranthians, and they were testing every skill both he and the sword could bring to bear. He was tiring, he had scratches on his legs and arms, and they were advancing on him. And then he heard the clacking of metal. He turned towards the drill hole to see if some new, strange creature was coming through. But there was nothing. And then out of the corner of his eye, he saw his knight's helmet fall to the ground. The knight, it was gone. Oh no, he didn't know what to do. So he swung his blade and ran as fast as he could. He ran along the outside of the dome. The Cranthians jogged behind him, but apparently they weren't able to run as fast as a human. He noticed several of them darting off to the chairs where the pilots sat. He sprinted as fast as he could to intercept them, and he managed to. And he even managed to fight them off, slay two of them, and have one retreat towards the hole, limping with a bloodied leg. But suddenly, more of them surrounded him, until they were forming a circle around the chairs. First there were 5, then there were 10. They kept pouring through the hole. Finally, there were 30. Craig stood, shivering with fear. His blade rose. He knew he had bravery in his heart, but he also knew this was a hopeless battle. But there was nothing else he could do. Not just his life was at stake, the life of all the humans on the planet Earth, rather the spaceship Earth, were at stake. He raised his blade and he screamed, but as he did so, Carlos opened his eyes. And though his mouth barely moved, a loud "Stop!" reverberated through the entire dome, so loud that the Cranthians stepped backward, looking around, questioning where such a fearsome sound could have came from. Carlos spoke once again, and though barely a whisper escaped from his real mouth, the same loud voice reverberated through the dome. "Leave now or perish!" The Cranthians drew their blades and walked forward. "Very well," said the voice that was somehow Carlos, and he closed his eyes. Nothing happened. The creatures started advancing once more, and Craig became engaged in combat with 2 of them. He was so focused on the fighting, he barely noticed the staircase that had opened from the floor below him, several feet away. He barely noticed the creatures, humanoid in form but clearly made of metal, wielding massive blades that shimmered as if with electricity or some kind of energy. 10 of them came, and they launched into the Cranthians like a knife through butter. Their movements were machine-like, quick and precise. They fought with perfect accuracy. Every blow was blocked. Every strike of theirs was successful or part of a sequence that led them to either chasing away a Cranthian or doing damage to him. Now, though the Cranthians kept pouring through the hole, and it seemed like their numbers were insurmountable, these new robotic creatures, these steel humans, whatever they were called, were protecting the pilots with fierceness that Craig had never imagined. For a time, he lost himself in the battle. It was almost as if the sword made him live in the present moment. He attacked, he parried, he swung, he dived, he somersaulted, he rolled, and then he heard a scream. This wasn't the scream of a Cranthian. This wasn't the scream of one of the metallic creatures. It was the scream of Carlos. He looked over, and though he knew not how it happened, he could see a spear protruding just to the right of Carlos's neck. Carlos screamed, "Craig!" Craig walked over. Carlos's head lulled down for a moment, and then his eyes refocused on Craig. "Craig, you You must take my place. I wouldn't ask you to do this without the training, but without me, we lose control of the ship. And then Carlos closed his eyes and stopped breathing. Craig didn't know if he died. But what he did know is that one moment, Carlos was sitting in that chair, not moving. The next, there was a bright flash, a pop. It sounded like a firework. And when he looked back, Carlos was gone. The chair was empty. And at that same moment, a rumbling started. This wasn't a drill. This was not even an earthquake. Craig could feel it in his bones that the whole planet had started shaking. The rumble progressively got worse and worse and worse until the Cranthians looked around. They stopped fighting. Some of them started running back towards the opening. They had to see what was happening. The metal humanoids, however, kept fighting until all of the Cranthians were fleeing. Craig looked at the chair. He remembered what he'd been told by the first woman he had met in that strange temple. What was her name? Esmeralda? She had told him of a card with a circle with 3 eyes in it. And she had said, in an emergency, if he had to become a pilot or take their place, to use this card. So, not knowing what was going to happen, not knowing if he should be afraid, he sat down in the chair. He took the card, he set it on the armrest, and it started glowing immediately. It glowed orange, the color of the sun an hour before the sun sets. Its glow soon infused the entire chair that he was sitting in, and he felt the chair grow warm. Then he saw the stone of the chair come out and wrap around his arms and legs. And for a moment he wanted to struggle, but it was too late. His arms, his legs, his stomach, and soon most of his chest were part of the chair. "What do I do?" he called out. Then he heard a voice in his head. It seemed to come from the chair. "Close your eyes. Join us." So he closed his eyes and he asked, "What do I do?" And the voice said, "Let go of your body. Come into the dream space." So he closed his eyes, took a deep breath. He tried to forget about his arms and his legs. He tried to forget about his back and his chest. He took as many slow breaths as he could, and with each breath, he imagined his consciousness sinking into a peaceful, serene blackness. For a time, he found himself alone in that place, uncaring, for the first time in his life, one with the present moment, with reality, with the universe, with himself. He had never felt this before. And then, like magic, appeared Mary and the other pilots. He saw them. Their faces looked strained. "We need your help. Come!" And he noticed that they were standing around a giant wheel. It looked as if it were an old wheel, the kind you would see on a ship that sailed the open seas long before computers existed. They were struggling. The wheel seemed to want to turn to the left, but they were trying to pull it to the right. So over he went, and he added his strength to theirs. And before long, they stabilized the wheel. It stopped pulling, and he had the realization that the thrumming, the vibrating, the quaking from outside had first slowed and then stopped. They took up places, 2 on each side of the wheel, for it emerged itself out of that strange blackness, and there was nothing else here. "What is this?" asked Craig. "It's how we keep the ship on track," said Mary. "It's how we make sure that no one person can control it." Craig thought about it for a moment. "Mary," he said, "Carlos and you and the other pilots, you talked about a great artificial intelligence. You said it held all of human information, that it helped us navigate between the stars. Why this? What is this?" Mary tilted her head down. "Well, we don't know, and the AI says it's forbidden to tell us. But what we do know is there always needs to be 4 pilots, and we all need to work in unison. For if we don't, it's almost as if the ship loses its will and tries to disperse simultaneously in every direction." One of the other pilots, whose name Craig couldn't remember, said, "We think it's a fail-safe device. Our thought is if the Cranthians somehow managed to get in here and get control of our ship, they wouldn't know how to use this wheel or wouldn't be able to do so in time, and the ship would burst forth into a million particles and spread forth into the universe. Craig thought about that. He didn't like this. "So, is this all you do?" he said. Mary looked at him. "Well, no," she said. "We have to do other things, but we always must be with the wheel. Since we work in a computer space, when there's 4 of us here, if we're holding the wheel steady, there's other things we can do. But we don't have time to show you those now. They take years of training. How did you get in here?" He said, "Well, Carlos is dead." The look on Mary's face fell like a waterfall down a lonely mountain. The other 2 pilots seemed less affected, but they too weren't happy. "I see," she said. "And now you are here. You are one of us." And Craig said, What about those creatures? What are we going to do? Who's going to protect us?" Mary said, "I don't know. All we can hope is that the AI finds us another protector. But Craig, there's something that you must know." Craig looked at her. "You're stuck in this chair forever, Craig. I know it might seem hopeless and scary. All of us felt that way at first. But please know that what you do, the sacrifice you made, is going to protect your friends, your family, our whole species." Craig looked down. "Will I never see my parents, my family, or my friends again?" And Mary said, "Well, that's not exactly the case. Remember when I told you that the Earth could make holographic projections wherever it wanted? It also grants us that power. We can see our family. We can even touch and feel them. So once this crisis is solved, you will be able to visit your family and walk once more upon the earth. It won't be the same, but you will be able to." Craig knew what she said was true. He knew the sacrifice had been worth it. Somehow he knew since the first day the strange things had started happening that he was on a date with destiny. But it didn't make it any easier. He stood there holding the wheel, wondering what was going to come next. Okay, Alden, that is going to be the end of part 8 of Craig. I will hopefully get to part 9 very soon, the next night you are not home. I want you to go to sleep tonight knowing that you are loved, always in my heart, and you're the best part of my life, and I'm always there for you. I love you.